As I stood at the edge of their table, the bustling world around me seemed to fade into silence. Her laughter abruptly halted as her wide eyes locked onto mine, her face turning pale with shock. Without a word, I slid the divorce papers onto the table, placing them carefully between her wineglass and plate. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady but icy. Her companion froze, his self-assured demeanor crumbling as he realized who I was. The atmosphere became suffocating, heavy with the weight of betrayal. Her trembling hands reached for the envelope, and as she opened it, her expression shifted from confusion to utter despair. This was the moment it all fell apart. Before delving further into this story, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss an update. The restaurant radiated a subtle sophistication. Dim lighting cast a golden glow over sparkling wine glasses and crisp white tablecloths. Gentle music floated through the air, mingling with the low hum of conversations. Laughter, light and carefree, punctuated the elegant atmosphere. But for John, it was a cruel melody underscoring his anguish. Standing at the entrance, his suit impeccable and his expression unreadable, he held a crisp, white envelope in his hand. Though outwardly composed, his fingers trembled slightly, betraying the storm raging within. His dark eyes, clouded with unspoken pain, scanned the room until they found her. Sarah sat with her back to him, her laughter slicing through the air like a knife. Her hand rested lightly on Peter's arm, her touch lingering in a way that spoke of intimacy. She leaned toward him, her blue dress catching the light in a way that felt like a cruel mockery of their past. Peter, exuding confidence and completely unaware of the approaching storm, smiled as his hand brushed against hers. The scene was suffocating, every breath John took feeling heavier under the weight of betrayal. Steeling himself, he took a step forward, his resolve solidifying with each stride. Their marriage had begun as a masterpiece of shared dreams and unwavering passion. Evenings were filled with laughter, hands intertwined across candlelit tables. Over time, though, the vivid colors of their relationship dulled. Routine crept in like an unwelcome guest, turning heartfelt conversations into hollow exchanges. Shared dinners became quieter, the clinking of utensils filling the void where words once thrived. Their bed, once a haven of whispered secrets and tender moments, grew colder, the distance between them an unspoken chasm. John had tried to bridge the gap. Surprise flowers and planned getaways were met with polite, distant smiles, her gaze often elsewhere. Sarah, meanwhile, yearned for a spark that routine had extinguished. She avoided John's searching eyes, her affection reduced to fleeting gestures that felt more like shadows of the past. The subtle changes, the way she turned away when he leaned in, the hesitation in her embrace, spoke volumes. Thread by thread, the fabric of their union unraveled, leaving behind only a fragile shell of what once was. John couldn't ignore the signs forever. The late nights she excused as art events or meetings with students had initially seemed plausible. But as her absences grew more frequent, his unease transformed into a persistent weight in his chest. One evening, she arrived home hours late, her face flushed and her words rehearsed but hollow. "The gallery owner wanted to discuss a collaboration," she explained, avoiding his gaze. Her excuses became thinner, her explanations more strained. The phone calls were another clue. John would often walk into a room to find her speaking in hushed tones, her laughter unfamiliar. The calls would abruptly end when she noticed him, her dismissive wave accompanied by strained smiles. "Just a student," she'd insist, but her voice lacked conviction. The tension grew unbearable. Her phone, once an afterthought, seemed glued to her hand, its buzzing notifications a constant intrusion. One night, when John leaned closer to her on the couch, she flinched, tucking her phone out of sight. "It's nothing," she assured him, though the tightness in her voice told a different story. When her late nights became more frequent, her excuses grew vaguer. "A last-minute meeting," she would claim, her eyes darting anywhere but toward his. Her hands fidgeted with her bag, and John's patience thinned. One rainy evening, as she rushed out the door to meet a colleague, John stood in the hallway, watching her disappear into the downpour. Anger simmered beneath his hurt. He wanted to trust her, but his instincts screamed otherwise. That night, sitting in his dark study, he made a choice. He had to uncover the truth. Hiring a private investigator wasn't easy for John. For weeks, he wrestled with the decision, torn between his desire to trust Sarah and the gnawing doubt consuming him. But after yet another night of vague excuses, he knew trust alone wasn't enough. The investigator, Alina, was sharp and professional. As John recounted Sarah's late-night meetings and secretive phone calls, he added almost pleadingly, "It could all be nothing." Alina nodded, her face neutral. "If it's something," she said, "we'll find it." At first, Alina uncovered nothing unusual, errands and work commitments. But on the third day, she called with a lead. "She's meeting someone," Alina said. "Not at a gallery or school, but a downtown cafe." John's heart sank as Alina sent photos. Sarah sat across from a man, her face lit with a smile John hadn't seen in years. Her posture was intimate, her hand resting lightly on his. The man was tall, sharply dressed, and entirely unfamiliar. Over the next week, Alina's investigation revealed more. The man, Peter, was not just an affair partner, but a con artist with a history of deception. He targeted wealthy women, charming them and exploiting their trust. Sarah, yearning for something more, had become his latest mark. Bank records confirmed her transfers to accounts John didn't recognize, significant sums, carefully distributed to avoid detection. The betrayal was deeper than infidelity. Sarah had jeopardized their financial security for a man who saw her as a payday. John's pain was immeasurable. But instead of rage, a deep sadness took hold. The vibrant woman he once loved had been reduced to someone desperate enough to fall for hollow promises. Still, he knew what had to be done. This wasn't about fury. It was about reclaiming his dignity. Armed with evidence, John prepared to confront them both with precision and composure. The restaurant buzzed with elegance, its polished atmosphere betraying no hint of the storm about to erupt. John entered, his steps deliberate, his face calm but unreadable. Sarah didn't notice him at first, too absorbed in Peter's attention. But as John approached, her laughter wavered, her expression freezing as she met his gaze. Color drained from her face, and Peter's confidence faltered, his movements betraying unease. "Good evening," John said, his voice measured but cutting. He placed the envelope on the table, sliding it between Sarah's glass and plate with deliberate precision. The soft thud of paper on wood echoed louder than any conversation around them. Neither spoke, the silence between them more damning than words ever could. At first, Sarah stared at the envelope as though it were an explosive device, her hands trembling slightly as they hovered above the table. Peter leaned back in his chair, attempting to regain his usual confidence, but the tightness in his jaw and the darting of his eyes between John and Sarah betrayed his unease. John remained unmoving, his posture calm yet commanding, his hands resting at his sides, a silent display of restrained authority. "I think you should read it," John said, his voice even, devoid of malice but brimming with an undeniable command. Sarah's lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but no words came. Her fingers brushed the edge of the envelope, hesitant, as though touching it would force her to confront the truth she desperately wished to avoid. Peter cleared his throat, his attempt to break the tension clumsy. "Look, maybe this isn't the right place," he started, but John's gaze snapped to him, sharp and unwavering. "You don't get to decide that," John said, his tone cutting through the air with precision. Peter recoiled slightly, the pretense of confidence slipping further from his face. Sarah finally opened the envelope, her hands shaking so violently that the paper inside rustled as she unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the words, and with each line, her expression crumpled further. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, glancing at John with a desperate, pleading look. "John, she began, her voice faltering. John raised a hand, silencing her. "Don't," he said softly but firmly. "I know everything, Sarah. Every excuse. Every lie. I've seen it all. And it ends here." The room seemed to pause, the surrounding diners oblivious to the storm unfolding mere feet away. Peter shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable, as John's cold gaze turned to him. "And you," John said, his tone dropping to something colder. "Do you want to explain yourself, or should I do it for you?" Peter stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure. "I think we should all just calm down," he said, his attempt to sound reasonable undone by the nervous edge in his tone. John leaned in slightly, his words quieter but no less cutting. "Calm," he repeated, his voice a chilling whisper. "You conned my wife, stole from my family, destroyed what we built together. You don't get to ask for calm." Tears finally spilled over Sarah's cheeks as her composure shattered completely. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Peter, looking increasingly cornered, darted his gaze toward the door, clearly contemplating an escape. John, unyielding, didn't budge. The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. At last, John straightened, the finality of the confrontation settling over him. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," he said, his voice steady, resolute. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving a silence so profound it seemed to echo. The tension in the room was palpable as John stepped back, his voice cold but measured. "Good evening," he said, his gaze steady as he placed the envelope on the table. "I think you should read this." Sarah froze, her breath hitching. Her hands hovered over the envelope, trembling as though the paper might burn her if touched. "What are you doing here?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes darting between John and Peter. John's expression remained unreadable, his calm demeanor masking the turmoil beneath. "I'm finishing what you started," he replied, his tone even but laced with unmistakable finality. "Go on, open it." Sarah's fingers fumbled as she picked up the envelope, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. Slowly, she unfolded the paper inside, her eyes darting over the text. The color drained from her face. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. This isn't necessary. We can talk about this." John's eyes narrowed, his voice unwavering. "Talk?" he echoed. "Like the way you've been talking to him." He gestured toward Peter without shifting his gaze from Sarah. Peter, who had been sitting in stiff silence, attempted a casual tone, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Listen," he began. "I don't think this is the time or place for—" "Don't," John interrupted, his voice low but cutting. His gaze locked on Peter, and the weight of his words made him falter. "You've had plenty of time to run your game. It's over now." Peter shifted uneasily, his once smooth demeanor unraveling. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his tone defensive. John leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Don't you? Should I explain to Sarah about your history? The scams? The aliases? The bank transfers? Or would you like to do that yourself?" Sarah's head snapped toward Peter, her expression a mixture of confusion and betrayal. "What is he talking about?" she demanded, her voice cracking. Peter stammered, his usual composure now a distant memory. "Sarah, I can explain." "Enough," John said, straightening, his gaze heavy with finality. "You've both said enough. Now live with it." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a deafening silence that carried more weight than words ever could. Sarah collapsed into herself, tears streaming down her face as the weight of her choices came crashing down. Peter, his mask of confidence fully shattered, fidgeted with the edge of the table, glancing nervously toward the exit. For a moment he looked as though he might speak, but instead he pushed his chair back abruptly. The harsh scrape of its legs against the floor turned heads from nearby tables. "This isn't my fight," Peter muttered, his voice trembling as he adjusted his jacket with shaky hands. He cast a fleeting glance at Sarah, whose tear-streaked face offered no solace, then hurried toward the door, clumsily making his exit. "Go ahead," John called after him, his voice calm but scathing. "Run, like you always do. That's the man you chose over us, Sarah," he added, his gaze flicking to her. "A coward who takes what he can and bolts the moment it gets hard." Peter hesitated briefly at the door, as though considering a retort, but the weight of John's words crushed any thought of defiance. Without looking back, he pushed the door open and disappeared into the night. The restaurant seemed to exhale as the tension eased, though the aftermath still hung heavy. John looked at Sarah one last time, his expression softening for just a moment. "When you gamble everything on a lie, this is all you're left with," he said quietly. And with that, he walked away, leaving Sarah to confront the emptiness Peter had left behind. Her eyes, red and swollen, searched John's face for a hint of softness, any trace of hope that he might change his mind. But his cold, unyielding gaze remained fixed. "It ended the moment you made your choice," he repeated, his voice low and measured. No, Sarah sobbed, shaking her head, her voice breaking as she tried to form the words. It was a mistake. I was lost. I didn't. Her voice cracked, and she covered her mouth with trembling hands. I didn't know what I was doing. I believed in something that wasn't real. But now I see it. I see everything. John's expression tightened, the faintest flicker of something unspoken crossing his face before he straightened. You see it now? He asked, his tone sharper, slicing through her desperate pleas like ice. After the lies, the deceit, and the betrayal, you suddenly see it? You see it now because you've lost everything. But you didn't see it when I stood before you, trying to hold us together. I was wrong, she cried, her voice rising, raw and broken. I was blind, selfish, call it whatever you want. But I'm begging you, John, for the sake of our family, for what we used to have, please. John's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. He exhaled slowly, his tone chillingly calm. You made your choices, Sarah. Now live with them. The weight of his words left no room for argument, extinguishing any last glimmer of hope. He turned and walked away, his steps steady, leaving Sarah crumpled in her seat, consumed by the magnitude of her loss. Just as John reached the edge of the table, he paused. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, the weight of everything unsaid pressing on him. When he turned back, his expression wasn't cold, it was resolute. A man making one final attempt to salvage what truly mattered. This isn't just about you and me anymore, he said, his voice quieter but firm. What's broken between us can't be fixed. Not after this. But the kids, they still need a mother. Sarah lifted her tear-streaked face, her trembling hands clutching the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. They don't deserve to suffer because of our mistakes, John continued, his gaze unwavering. Whatever you've lost, whatever you've destroyed, it's not too late to be there for them. Fix yourself, Sarah, for their sake, if not for mine. He lingered for a moment, searching her face for any sign of understanding. Then, without another word, he walked away, leaving her with the echo of his final plea, a responsibility she could no longer ignore. As John stepped into the crisp night air, a mix of emotions washed over him. Relief, like the release of a long-held breath, mingled with a dull ache that refused to fade. Walking away felt final, but the weight of it was undeniable. For years, he had loved Sarah with everything he had. He remembered the early days of their marriage, late-night conversations about their dreams, her laughter as he fumbled through a dance in their tiny living room, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about her art. Those memories, once a source of comfort, now felt distant, like watching someone else's life through a frosted window. He had clung to those moments, hoping they could serve as a foundation to rebuild what was broken. But tonight had revealed the truth. That foundation had long since crumbled. His love for Sarah wasn't enough to bridge the chasm created by her betrayal. Still, there was no anger left in him, only sorrow. Sorrow for the life they had lost, for the future they had imagined but would never share. Most of all, sorrow for their children, who would grow up in a world where the family they knew was forever altered. As John reached his car, he paused, catching his reflection in the window. He looked tired, more so than he had ever felt. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a faint spark of resolve. His children deserved better, stability, love, and a father who wouldn't let the bitterness of the past define their future. John straightened his posture, exhaling deeply. The road ahead would be hard, but he was determined to move forward. The love he had once poured into Sarah would now be redirected toward his children. They would know they were secure and cherished, even in the absence of the life he had fought to preserve. As he drove away, the sorrow began to loosen its grip, replaced by a quiet determination to start anew, for himself, and most importantly, for them. The house was silent, almost unbearably so. Sarah sat in the living room, her fingers tracing the edge of a framed family photo on the coffee table. It captured a moment of joy. John smiling with his arm around her, their children laughing as they leaned against her. It felt like a relic from another life, one now irretrievably distant. She stared at the photo for what felt like hours, her thoughts spiraling through the choices that had brought her here, the excuses she had made, the lies she had told herself, the allure of Peter's charm. What once felt thrilling now seemed hollow and selfish. In chasing fleeting desires, she had lost everything that truly mattered. John's words from the restaurant echoed in her mind. Fix yourself. For them, if not for me. His tone had been cold, his message final, but the truth behind it was undeniable. She had failed him, their marriage, and most painfully, their children. The emptiness of the house pressed down on her, amplifying her guilt. She moved to the couch and sank into its worn cushions, clutching a pillow to her chest as though it could shield her from the weight of her emotions. Memories flooded back, the nights she and John spent planning their future, the laughter they had shared. She had traded all of that for an illusion, and now she was left with the aftermath. Yet beneath the crushing guilt, a faint ember of resolve began to stir. She couldn't undo the past, but she also couldn't remain paralyzed by it. If she was going to rebuild anything, for herself or her children, she had to confront the person she had become and understand why she had allowed herself to fall so far. The next morning, Sarah took the first step. She called a therapist, her voice shaky as she explained, "I don't even know where to start. I don't recognize myself anymore." Therapy became a space for reflection, a painful but necessary mirror to her actions. Through the sessions, Sarah began to unpack the truths she had avoided. Her dissatisfaction with herself, her fear of aging, and her mistaken belief that excitement could only come from outside herself. She cried often during those sessions, but each tear felt like a release, a step toward healing and understanding. At home, she started small. She cleaned out the rooms she had avoided for weeks, the ones still echoing with John's absence. She wrote letters she might never send, apologies to John, her children, and even herself. Silently but with conviction, she promised to do better. Sarah knew the path ahead would be long and lonely, but for the first time in a while, she felt a faint glimmer of hope. The scars of her choices would remain, but she was determined to transform them into lessons, a foundation on which to rebuild her life. This time, she vowed to rebuild with honesty, humility, and the unwavering love her children deserved.